This couple comes out of the hospital after the boyfriend is released, having experienced heart palpitations. And within 30 minutes to an hour later, he shoots her. Hi, welcome to episode 5 of When Death Awaits. The case we'll be talking about today is a case out of South El Monte. It involves gambling. It involves jealousy. It involves murder. All of these will be discussed in this rather intriguing case that I believe will leave you with a lot of questions as to what truly motivated this individual to do what he did.
Hey, welcome to episode 5 of When Death Awaits. We wanted to get started here just by thanking all of you who have liked us, followed us, given us comments and feedback. This is all of our first time doing this, and we're trying to unlock all the treasure trove of stories that Uncle Rich has across his 17 years at the LA County Sheriff's Homicide Department. We got another great case for you today. It's out of South El Monte, and we'll get right into it. Uncle Rich, lead us away.
Well, it's interesting how it came about. Needless to say, it was a warm Sunday morning. I got called out to South El Monte with my partner, and basically when I arrive, the door to this particular single-family residence is opened. At the threshold of the door and in the living room floor is just blood splattered about. So that in and of itself told me that there was something really, really serious about this. It was going to be more than just a walk-through investigation. And I say that only because I couldn't necessarily start to search the property, because I learned from the deputies that were in fact had first responded that a 911 call had come in. And in the 911 call, the male caller, and we later learned his name was Mr. Fan, had called and said, "She shot me and I shot her." At that point, they responded to the location, but they couldn't find him initially because it was on a cell phone. And cell phones, unlike when you have a hard line when you call 911, the operator at the other end of either a police station or fire station, they're going to know exact location. It'll come up. Having worked at a desk myself in the law enforcement agencies, I'm very familiar with how that functions. In this case, though, with cell phones, you have to sort of triangulate where, in fact, that individual is calling from. Ultimately, they found him, and he was lying on the threshold of this household. And at that point, they then contained the location, and they, as they told me, and at that point I had to make a determination as to who actually owned the property. And again, it's Sunday morning, and I learned that he in fact was the primary residence of this location, which, again, I don't want to get too technical here, but as a result of him being the primary residence, the question is, could I search the property? And lo and behold, because I couldn't search the property, I had to get a search warrant. And
can I pause you there real quick?
Sure.
Because a question immediately pops to my mind is, so this guy calls, it's his, you find out it's his residence. There's blood everywhere in what you can call the foyer area of the house. Is there like an expediency exception that you could kind of go in, you prevent further damage? But I know there's the rules on the Fourth Amendment and getting a search warrant.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. There is the exigency exception. However, I'll just say this. When they went into the house, they went into the bedroom and they did find a deceased female. And then, of course, this individual who was in fact bleeding profusely from the upper shoulder area. They then transported him, but because it's his residence, other than for exigency purposes, we could gather any immediate information or potentially, see for the purposes of rescuing somebody. But once we'd established that that person had been deceased, then it suddenly becomes a crime scene. And because it's his residence, I was required to get a search warrant.
Got it. And can you walk us through, you said it was a Sunday morning. I imagine judges aren't at the courthouse. So is there like a quick drive-through Valvoline search warrant process?
I wish. I wish that would be the case. Over the years, as you mentioned, it was 17 years at Homicide alone. I had a number of I would call them associates that are judges, and I would periodically be able to call them, and I would get a search warrant signed by way of a phone call. And then, of course, I would then write it up, and then I would take it to them the next business day. However, in this case, I couldn't find one. So the actual way it works is if you're an investigator, you call the DA's office. They then refer you to a DA. You then submit it to the DA. They read it. Then they get a hold of a judge. So it's a long, arduous process. Could take up to 2 to 3 hours. However, it turns out there was a female deputy sheriff at the scene. She said she knew a judge. Unfortunately, that judge was working out, and she knew her private number. And it turns out this judge was at a 24-hour fitness center in very close proximity to where I was investigating this case. So what did I do? I got in my car. First, I had to put together a search warrant, and I got my typewriter out, printed it all up. That took me about another 35, 40 minutes. And at that point, then I drove to the 24-hour fitness center where this judge was working out.
I'm just picturing you showing up with your badge. Stop working out, everybody.
Well, I was
Rich in the building.
I was in my homicide suit, if you will, with my jacket on, and I walk into this place, and I'm in the lobby. It's evident that I'm not there to work out, and so I'm looking around to see, and here comes the judge. She's getting off the elliptical. She's perspiring. She's not more than maybe 5'2". And no offense to that, her height or anything like that, but I'm curious, was this the gal or guy that I'm waiting for? And she walks up to me and she goes, "I'm the judge you're looking for." And she then goes to the counter, starts to read the affidavit or the search warrant. And at that point, she then turns to me, and everybody's now is curious as to why this gal, who they don't know what she does, was talking to a guy with a suit at the counter. And at that point, she then asked me to raise my right hand to swear that this information is true and correct under penalty of perjury. And now it gets obvious that everybody is looking at me at this Sunday morning workout experience. And it was a little bit, needless to say, nerve-wracking to say the least, because I'm like, you're kidding me, right? You want me to raise my hand? And so she went and made me go through the whole formality of getting this search warrant signed. And I think to a large extent, she was kind of enjoying the fact that she had some level of authority over me. And if I may add, she at this point wants to also let everybody know that she is in fact somebody of some station in society. Okay, I digress. Let's go back to the case.
Love it.
So at that point, I went back to the location, let everybody know. I had 2 criminalists there, ballistics and a physical criminologist. Basically, we want to try and develop an understanding of what transpired as a result of this incident. So we get there, and as I'm there at this location, we're now able to go into the home, and our focus is primarily in the bedroom. And that's where it gets really interesting. The bedroom is not more than maybe, I would say 10 by 12, if that. And there again lies a deceased female. The paramedics apparently had removed her blouse in an effort to try and revive her, but needless to say, with no success. And more than that was, now we had to find out what happened. if I may go back just for a minute, and because I want to give you a sequence of events. When the Mr. Fan was taken to the hospital, he was taken to South El Monte Hospital. Ironically, he had just left there not more than an hour before, because he had admitted himself because he was having heart palpitations. And during that time, which we caught on video because I asked security to give me video later on, of course, they said, well, we're going to release you now. Do you have somebody to pick you up? And who does he have pick him up? Mrs. Wynn. And happened to be the gal that's on the bed.
Yeah, and I think you have the video, and I don't know if we're planning to share it on our YouTube, but yeah, I think you see from the videos, it's actually the woman who is lying in the bed, dead, who picks him up, and they have a warm embrace. So you said this is like an hour and a half, maybe 30 minutes before.
Right.
So they seem on good terms.
Yeah.
30 minutes later, you get the call. She shot me, I shot her, and he's back at South El Monte,
right,
getting treated for a gunshot wound.
Correct.
And she's lying here. So, I'm sure you're confused. What did you see at the crime scene? Or I'm sure you're starting to now put all the pieces together based off the evidence that's at hand.
Absolutely. And there was, again, as we started to examine the crime scene, we come to learn that there are two guns on the bed, and she's lying on the bed. She does have, in fact, a gunshot wound to her chest, and there's also a bullet hole that went through the window. And again, to some extent, it corroborated what he said. We had a level of sort of, okay, maybe he's telling the truth. But then it starts to get a little more problematic as we learn that her bullet wound was in a downward trajectory, which means that she was probably sitting down at the time. And his bullet wound was, in fact, a shoulder injury, which went straight through. We never recovered that bullet, by the way. And along those lines, we had other issues with regards to his story, because during the examination of the crime scene, we also find a note, which we couldn't interpret at the time, but we subsequently did, and it turned out to be a suicide note. But more than anything else was the fact that we found some recently developed photos in a photo album that appears to be of a Vietnamese wedding. And that contained the photos of Mr. Fan, but not Mrs. Wynn.
Uh-oh.
Not Miss Wynn, I should say. So,
and Mrs. Wynn, if we hadn't made it clear, is the woman who is deceased.
Correct. And we established that she, in fact, was the girlfriend to Mr. Fan. And so now we have her deceased. We have two guns. We have a bullet hole that's not consistent with her sitting down at the time that she allegedly fired this gun. So there was some inconsistencies in his story, and it started to unravel in terms of how we were interpreting this. And by the way, I might add, I'm not interpreting this. I'm getting this information from our criminologist, who then I, basically using my own investigative experience, agreed with what they were in fact telling me, because they had consistently did it scientifically. Again, we have a ballistics expert by way of our firearms expert, and we also have a physical expert which develops the crime scene so we can make a definitive determination as to what transpired, so we can in fact sort of recreate the story, if you will.
So to recap a little bit, the scene and what it sounds like the criminologist and all the ballistic experts were to put together was that she was most likely sitting on the bed, maybe at the edge of the bed, and he was standing in front of her, and he shot her from the entrance of the shoulder, the bullet went, from up to down.
Correct.
Through her chest.
Correct.
And his bullet wound is almost like a straight shot through. So either she's like really tall, or she shot him with her like up. I mean, maybe that's a possibility, but I'm sure this is what you're all trying to piece together, and where you're seeing where the bullets are flying across the room. Those are probably all the questions.
Right? Absolutely, and that's where we have to draw our conclusions, because when we look at this in the big picture, we have to say to ourselves, why would he want to do this? And one of those aspects, of course, was, when did she discover these photos? It's evident that she didn't know about these photos, and that could have prompted the argument in terms of what transpired. But secondly, and more importantly, as we started to examine this crime scene, we also look at where the guns are located relative to the body, and also in the context of the shell casings, where are they located? So everything, putting it into its totality, starts to recreate a story that's not consistent with what he said. And so once we had that in its making, again, I let the sheriff's department, the deputies, know that this guy was going to be looked at as a potential murder suspect. And that changes the complexion of things, because at this point, he goes from being a victim to potentially being a suspect, and he is now going to be monitored 24 hours a day in his hospital bed. So that in and of itself changes the complexion of how I am going to approach him. But that's for a later point in terms of how and what I did with that. So
I'm curious, as we sort of hit this next stage of really deciphering the stages of what exactly happened. I mean, we have a suicide note. We have the wedding album. Talk to us about the suicide note a little bit. In regards, it was written in Vietnamese. Was this something that was found throughout the house? Was this a piece that was next to the bed? Was it in the living room?
And what does it say?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's fascinating. The note was placed on the couch where anybody could have walked in and found that note. It was on the couch where you sit down, and in fact, ultimately, when we had it interpreted, it was basically, I'm sorry for everything I've done. Take care of my son. There was no mention, interestingly enough, of Mrs. Nguyen, or the fact that he had been married. So these were all things that I was kind of curious as to what was motivating him to want to kill himself, when in reality, it came down to this, that if he had in fact, and having investigated, countless suicides myself, if you're going to commit suicide, you're not going to shoot yourself in the shoulder. You're going to shoot yourself in the head, or you're going to take pills, or whatever, hang yourself, or whatever the case is. And I don't want to be too cynical about this, but this was not a consistent with somebody wanting to kill themselves when you have a shoulder injury, which is non-fatal. And again, that being said, I think he knew exactly where to shoot that weapon into his body.
So quite possibly he could have written this note after the fact, or maybe pre-written it and had it ready if he had a plan of committing this crime?
I'd imagine he probably wrote it before, if he's bleeding out of his chest, right?
No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Yeah.
This note was there prior to him coming home from the hospital. And again, what prompted him to have those heart palpitations? What prompted him to call Mrs. Nguyen when he knew, in fact, that he had already been married to this woman in Vietnam not more than a week or two prior? He'd just come back from Vietnam. I mean, so when we talk about this, we have to ask ourselves, what would motivate him to put himself in this situation where now Miss Nguyen, who's completely in love with this man, which I've later learned, would ultimately result in him having to kill her in order to move forward, free from his financial obligations and all these other things that I'll later discuss. But that's where we get into the issues ultimately as to why the district attorney moved ahead with this.
And I'm curious, do we know any information about the wife in Vietnam?
We know that based on these photos, and I've talked to several Vietnamese people of culture, they say that she had some station in light of what she was wearing. And I'm looking at these photos now of the wedding photos where, Mr. Phan is there in complete white, looking, pointing at something. It's evident she's in a wedding gown, and then they have photos of them, in the Vietnamese traditional garb, and it was fascinating. Again, these photos, it was evident that they were relatively new, and I'll speak about who she is. We didn't do any necessarily any Vietnamese background on her, but she was nowhere to be found during the course of this investigation, and up until I met her later on.
And so you said you met her later on. Mm-hmm. So she came to the U.S.
Yes, she did. She came to the U.S. When it turns out now it's a few days later after this case is evolving, and I learned that Mr. Phan and Miss Nguyen had developed a deep financial debt to the Commerce Casino. We learned that he had been bankrupt at a furniture store, and things weren't going good for him at all. And then on top of that, I think that was one of his motivations for wanting to marry this woman in Vietnam, probably to get him out of his financial situation. But unfortunately, Miss Nguyen wasn't going to go or accept this thing as readily as he thought. More than that, I go to the LA County Medical Center where I see Mr. Phan. And lo and behold, who is nursing him back to good health? None other than the newly acquired Mrs. Phan from the photos.
Wow.
And I was like, whoa, she didn't waste any time. And he was happy to see me. I couldn't believe it. Hey, Mr. Ramirez. I'm like, wow, how you doing, Mr. Phan? I just want to advise you of your rights. And I advised him of his constitutional rights. And at that point, he turns to me and he says, she shot me, I shot her. That was pretty much his standard, statement in terms of how he was going to try and get himself out of this.
I mean, I'm just trying to replay in my head, like, putting myself in the shoes of, playing monk here. And it's they come back from the hospital after heart palpitations. And according to his story, I mean, how I'm piecing it in my head, I don't know if any of this is factual, but something happens. She sees this, and according to him, she sees this wedding album. And maybe, obviously they've probably been having arguments because of the gambling debts and whatnot. Somehow they both have guns in their hands, and they're very close to each other. Apparently they're in close proximity. And according to him, she shoots him, and then he shoots her, and then he drags himself to the front of the house and calls the cops, and that's his story. It seems all very fishy, and I can see where you kind of, after you're learning all about the motivations behind it, but the facts of the case are also very much introducing questions.
And you had a very good point. And unfortunately in the law enforcement world, cops are inherently cynical of people's stories. So we have to get to the root of the story in order to have some level of believability. And as as a homicide investigator, I don't even necessarily look at it not in terms of who lied and who's not lying, because I always look at it as everybody's lying to me until I can prove otherwise. And in this case, it became evident that he was lying by way of the evidence that we were in fact garnering from the crime scene, and by way of her position in the bed, to the extent, and I'll go even further in terms of attending the autopsy. The autopsy photos clearly reflect that the gunshot was in fact in a downward trajectory, which clearly reflected that she was sitting down at the time of the incident. Now, I got a coroner's photo here, which shows that the bullet went in a downward trajectory, clearly reflecting that she was sitting down at the time that she was shot. So going to the autopsy photo, coupled with the crime scene investigation, it was clear to me that there was some level of concern in terms of what he was saying and how he was trying to argue his way out of having shot her. And that, to me, brought me to the level of taking it to the district attorney's office for their evaluation and to determine whether they were going to go ahead and pursue a criminal filing on this. Because again, I'm merely a fact finder, and I just be candid with you guys. All I am is the fact finder. And if there is more evidence out there, if they could bring more evidence to me, I'm more than happy to provide it to the district attorney. But they didn't. And so Mr. Phan's story was starting to unravel in light of the fact that he had all of these other issues with her, with Mrs. Nguyen, that clearly reflected some level, if not ultimate level, of wanting to have to take her out in order for him to get out of his financial mess that he was in. And that is very troubling, to say the least.
I was just looking back through the case file, and Chris had the question earlier on when he wrote the suicide note. So just take it back to suicide note. I want to share this with the audience. Is actually in the trial case, he testified that he wrote the note 2 days before Miss Nguyen died. And I can read the note. It just brings a ton of questions for me too. On is this their kid together? Do you know that?
No, it's not their kid together. No.
Well, he wrote, I only regret one thing, that we cannot become husband and wife so that we can live the whole life together forever. Live together, and he repeats, live together the whole life. So then, therefore, I would hope for the next life, in case there is a next life. I will be doing so much better, and we will be able to become husband and wife, living together in a better way. So he's still selling like this false, love story to Miss Nguyen. Right. And another portion of the note, he wrote, I'm at fault towards you and my child. So I guess he had, maybe this is to another wife, I guess, who he had with the kid.
Right.
Together.
Right.
He wrote, please try to make sure that our child will be successful in life so that the child will not be in the position like I am. And then he wrote to the son as well and wrote, it's a little, the PDF's cut off a little bit, but he says something to the effect of when he gets older, just don't hold, I think, maybe anything against his mother. Say it's all my fault. Mm-hmm. Just blame everything on me. To every person that would still be alive after Mr. Phan, passed away, do not worry or do not be bothered by the fact that I'm not here anymore. Farewell to everybody, or goodbye to everybody. This guy's got stuff going on in his head. Obviously, he's in a dark place. I mean, we talk about a financial fraud and debt that he's been a part of. I'm sure people were after him. And I think, I might be cart before the horse here, but you find out that the woman he married in Vietnam, it sounds like she comes with a certain financial stature in Vietnam, and maybe that's a quick fix solution for him. To marry this woman and maybe help clear some of the debts. No
doubt about it. I truly believe that was one of his primary motivations. So what he was doing, in essence, and you had a really good point here, Omar, he was trying to remedy all of his woes at one fell swoop, marrying this gal, getting rid of Miss Nguyen, and on top of it all, trying to in some way resolve his issues with his other family, who had a lot of respect for him, but at the same token, there was, and having talked to his family, they realized that he was in some financial mess. So I truly believe, taking all of these things into consideration, coupled with the evidence in the bedroom, truly reflected that his motivation for wanting to do what he did in terms of taking out Mrs. Nguyen.
There's some more interesting stuff if you guys want me to read from
Please.
the case. From testimony from Mr. Fan about what went on between the events of getting picked up from the hospital by Miss Nguyen to getting home. And I can share it if you guys would like. But basically, I'll try to summarize a little bit. So on the way back to the home, he said that she was angry about his new wife. And then in the bedroom, that Miss Nguyen had demanded $4,600 and became upset with him because he didn't have it. And then, as we had discussed earlier, Fan goes to say he actually says she's sitting on the bed and he is standing. And then Fan said to Nguyen, "You don't know how to use a gun." I guess they have guns in each other's hands. He says, "Don't play with a gun. You don't know how to use a gun. Don't play with a gun." They're 6 feet apart. He moved towards her and said, "Give me the gun." And then he heard a noise, boom, and then his chest hurt. After Nguyen shot Fan in the chest, he says he was still moving forward towards her, and he was able to hold onto the hands and hold onto the gun. She's sitting in the bed, and while he was standing, he testified, "I think there was a struggle there. Then prior to me passing out, the gun was pointing toward her direction. Before I fell down and passed out, I knew that I did shoot towards that direction, and I passed out." So even his testimony is kind of like making himself sound fishy because he's admitting she's sitting down, but the exit wound on his chest, it doesn't show. You said it's a downward trajectory,
Right?
Or it went flat through his chest. So
Right, it went flat through him, but downward trajectory.
Down on her.
You're right.
So he's kind of admitting that she's sitting down, but it doesn't make sense for her shot going in the way it did
Exactly
on his while he's standing.
Right.
Also, on a couple other interesting things, he says he doesn't remember calling 911. He testified that his past relationship with Miss Nguyen was volatile. They'd broken up 6 or 7 times between 2007 and 2010. 2010 is when the events took place. He said they argued a lot because of his gambling, because that she had a gambling problem. And he said that in 2008, a neighbor called with him at work about a noise coming from their home. When he arrived, Nguyen was breaking things. Fan called the police. When the police arrived, she had stopped breaking. So he's putting a lot of blame on her. And Chris, did you want to hop in?
Yeah, just on the topic, while we're kind of diving into the evidence and the autopsy, reading a few of the comments here on YouTube, just diving in a little bit more. So obviously, 2 guns were at play here. Were there any fingerprints that we could have gotten off of Miss Nguyen's gun, or would that have helped in the case? Is that something that you usually look towards?
You always, you want to gather as much evidence as you can, up to and including fingerprints. I work street gangs. We're over in East LA, and we always had shootings. Never found a fingerprint on a gun. Working sheriff's homicide on a number of shootings, never found a fingerprint on a gun.
Sorry. You said in the 17 years you've never found a fingerprint on a gun?
No, I have known cases where fingerprints have been found on guns, but it was never any of my hundreds, if not thousands, of shootings that I investigated where I found a fingerprint on a gun.
Wait, what? In the movies, that's always like, everyone, I guess everyone really does clean the gun or whatnot.
Yeah. Well, it's also what they call the GSR, which is the gunshot residue. Those things are being called into question in terms of their validity as well. When you fire a gun, you get the sprinkles that come about on your hand, and in particular when you have a shooting like this, automatically there's going to have a GSR kit. The coroner's office will in fact examine the deceased if there is in fact a gun. And I don't believe they found GSR, but that's okay, because the reality is that they'll found that the GSR kits are not very valid in terms of determining if somebody in fact had shot a gun. But going back to the fingerprint issue, I would just say this, rarely do we find a fingerprint on a gun. It just doesn't happen. If it does happen, I would
mind blown emoji.
I've never, again, I know investigators that have found, but it's few and far between. And you think about it, if you look at the Beretta that was used in this case, it's got a, I guess a waffle type of handle, and you're not going to get fingerprints from that, you know. But
that's interesting. And also even too, just diving into the coroner and the autopsy, I know there's been a lot of interest from viewers just learning a little bit more of that process. Looking at some of the photos here to see the tool that's used inside of the wound to almost kind of, I guess, point of the direction of which way that went is obviously makes sense. But you know, when you see the photos of how you investigate and how that plays such a crucial part into, was he standing, was she sitting, it's a very fascinating sort of dive into that.
And yet the tools that they use, the tools themselves, are not very sophisticated. But when we talk about the toxicology and all those other elements to a pathologist's analysis, definitely they come into play. But when it comes to the tools themselves, I mean, give you guys a little insight. When to open up a chest to try and find a bullet, they use gardening shears to open up your chest cavity. So they use a wood saw to open up your skull, you know, and they have a vacuum so that the skull debris doesn't go all over the place.
My God, this is like Hannibal.
But I've been to more than my share of autopsies, so I go to and you as an investigator are required to go to these autopsies so you could give the pathologist, the coroner, an idea of what exactly transpired in terms of the history of the case.
Amazing. So you know, we've built it up. You've got all the facts built. Let's get the viewers into, like, where did this shake out at trial, and how was trial?
What trial was interesting because the coroner's, the district attorney in this case had to establish by way of the evidence that he in fact not only shot her, but then inflicted the wound on himself. And that was, I would say, a very accomplished litigator, to say the least, because you had the defense that was counter-arguing that, but then you had the district attorney in this case, Miss Terry Tiggleson, who I thought was a very accomplished litigator. But during the course of the trial, I found it interesting how she, being a mother herself, turned to the jury and she looked and she gave them this, like, don't believe him. Like, she was talking to a group of kids, and I was like, you know.
You're shaking in your boots.
You know, and they're like, maybe we shouldn't. You know, I'm not suggesting that was what their thought process was, but I'm thinking, that's what I was thinking when she started doing the old finger, waving, don't believe him. I'm like, wow, that's an interesting argument. I've never seen that one. And I've seen a lot of arguments, but that one was interesting. Ultimately, the jury did come back guilty, and they gave him life without, I think life and I think 10 years. I think he got 35 years, and 35 years to life because of the gun allegation for the incident.
So he's still serving his sentence.
Oh, he'll be there for a long time to come.
Wow, and no, we don't know anything about his wife at the time, or I guess maybe still wife. I don't know what's happened since, but. Has anything come out? Or I doubt you follow up on these things. We got to put some journalists on this. But
yeah,
where are they now?
Yeah, I didn't follow up on whatever happened to the wife. Maybe she returned to Vietnam. I'm not sure, but nonetheless, that was in fact pretty much summarizes this case. And it's funny. I have a photo of myself because it was a hot sunny day. I'm outside underneath this canopy drinking water as I'm trying to evaluate what we have. And I think that, to me, sort of sums up this case because it truly did have a lot of complexities that I had to consider when you're talking about putting somebody away for the rest of their lives. And I think that in and of itself weighs heavy on any homicide investigator.
I think what's probably difficult about cases like this too is you're working with the evidence you have at hand, and under the rules that have been set in criminal law by the government, by the lawmakers, you have to do your best to present the facts and then it's on to an unbiased jury to make the decision on what you have at hand. So hopefully this leaves someone dangerous off the streets, and you did your job. But it's for all of the lovers out there. Take care of your significant others. Don't get into financial debt. This could be a nasty ending for some of you.
I couldn't agree with you more, and this definitely plays large into if whoever's listening out there just to keep those things in mind. You're absolutely right, Omar. That was some very good words to share.
Look, honey, I'm wearing my wedding ring. All right. I think with that, thank you again, Uncle Rich, Chris, taking us through this very electric lovers quarrel. If you haven't, check us out on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, the YouTube, and our socials as well. You'll find some cool photos from the case. And follow along, and until next time.
Can I just make one plug?
Yeah, of course.
And that is
it's your show.
I got a great case coming up.
Oh, let's hear it.
Just it's another lover's quarrel, but it ends very tragically, and I'll leave it at that. It's just a really good one. And I'm really looking forward to sharing that one.
Can you give us any small juicy details so the listeners know what to maybe expect?
Let's. It involves a really a good family whose father was visiting from another country, and at the same token, a boyfriend who was very disgruntled with a relationship that was about to be dissolved.
God, what is it with us men? My God. All right, well, we're looking forward to it. We're going to try and get it out as soon as possible. But thanks for tuning in. And until next time, this is When Death Awaits.
So long, everyone.
Take care.